Greetings, travelers. You ever wanted to learn fencing? Well then look away, because this job is a spellcaster. Red Mage's aesthetic bothers the seven hells out of me, always strutting around with their stupid rapier. Yeah, it's a staff 90% of the time, and it's a sword the rest of it. Wouldn't it make more sense for it to be a staff that turns into a sword, instead of a sword that turns into a staff? Now just imagine that for a second. A staff that's like a switchblade. Wouldn't have that been cooler? You know what? Just turn it into a baguette. That's about as creative as what we currently have. I'll give the outfits a pass, though. They look alright. Recently, I've noticed my guides have been expanding in size, so I'm going to do something a little different this time around. I'm going to explain the basics for this job first, and then towards the end of the video, give you some of the extra sauce you can start introducing to your cuisine when you feel more comfortable with the job. I put chapters in these videos anyways now for a reason. I was originally planning to make this a shorter guide, but realized that I should start fitting in as many mid-roll ads as I can, even though I don't do that. So here's another fairly long Final Fantasy XIV job guide. If you remember when I did an AMA a while back, I said that I thought Red Mage was alright, but my opinion has dwindled a little bit ever since I started playing it more. If you want to unlock this swordcaster, then you go to Ul'dah and talk to the Distraught Lass, which conveniently is the adjective you will use to describe yourself if you imbalance your mana. Why do people play this class? To have a battle raise. That's about it. Red Mage is often called one of the easiest classes in the game, and it is incredibly easy to pick up, until you look at an opener and you start having an existential crisis. Thankfully, I can ignore that for now. The core revolves around 5 spells and your passive. Only 3 of your spells can actually be casted, with 2 just taunting you with their see-through outline shrouded in mystery. These 2 skills have ridiculous cast times. Thankfully, your passive ability called Dual Cast makes it so that every other spell cast is instant, allowing you to use the spells that don't have ridiculous cast times and then instant cast one of the long cast time ones. The only stupid thing about Dual Cast, it will be consumed when you cast Sprint. Thank God I can finally instant cast Sprint. The amount of times you should hard cast Ver-Arrow or Ver-Thunder while already in combat is as much as the times you've played a card game and thought, yeah, that wasn't bullshit. So 0. If you're hard casting these spells as part of your rotation and not part of a pre-pull for an opener, I think you need to take a long look at yourself in the mirror as you submit your application to become a mentor. Where was I? Cast Red Magic, then cast either Ver-Arrow or Ver-Thunder. It doesn't really matter. Each of these skills have a chance to proc a grayed out skill. If you see one of these buttons glow, you should press it. These proc skills are like totally cool and stuff, and after you cast one, you now have dual cast again. So it's time to cast Ver-Arrow or Ver-Thunder. Which one should you actually cast? The one that you have less mana of. Thanks to a revolutionary new technology, you can store white and black mana in a display gauge on your UI. After that, you check for a proc. If you don't have one, back to the boring combo starter. Just keep doing that until you have at least 80 of each mana. Ensure that you're in melee range, and now you can slap them with your toothpick combo, and you have a choice. You see, you can cast either Ver-Flare or Ver-Holy. You're never gonna believe it. Cast the one that gives you the mana you have less of. This will guarantee a proc if you cast it according to the lesser mana. Although if your mana is perfectly balanced, I guess just use the one that you like the animation for more. And after you click that, you get to click Scorch. You did it. Back to default gameplay, because you don't have dual cast after casting Scorch. You might think I forgot something core to the melee combo with Core. Well, that would make sense if you tried playing this class intuitively, but no. Use Core on cooldown for damage, ensuring that you weave it properly after an instant cast, regardless of if you're about to go into a melee combo or not. In a similar fashion, Displacement and Engagement will also be used on cooldown for damage. These 2 skills share a cooldown. One just does damage, and the other one does more damage, but is a backflip of 15 yalms. Are you fucking kidding me? Did they actually make Elusive Jump a DPS button? Whose brilliant idea was that? Well, Displacement does do more damage, but you have to be real careful with that because depending on the arena, Displacement is just a button that sends you to the Shadow Realm, and that extra 50 potency doesn't mean jack shit if you die for it. Get ready to walk dead center in the boss's hitbox to avoid flinging yourself into the void. Engagement won't send you anywhere, although as you optimize where you stand in fights, Displacement is slightly better. depending. Although I won't mention leveling, the only thing that changes to the core as you level is just taking skills away from the melee wombo combo. You either don't have Scorch yet, or you don't have Verflare and Verholy yet. That's the main difference that I won't elaborate on. Congratulations, I'll help you out with an opener in a moment, but there's something that I have to talk about before we get to that. Oh, would you look at that? Is that me talking to the camera using my character as an avatar to remind you about generic YouTube bullshit? Yes it is. I know everyone loves to hear me say subscribe to Mr. Mediocre and to like or dislike the videos and leave comical comments on them for internet validation. If you really want to go bananas, you can always share my content with other living creatures. We are approaching the unholy karaoke livestream subscriber goal with only 1,400 more subs to get there, or whatever it is at the moment. At this point, I assume most people are wondering if I'm actually singing or just playing Yakuza for that stream. And I have to say, we're going to have to reach that goal for you to find out. Although if you are curious, I will set a specific date and time for that event once we never reach that goal. Thanks again for the support I have received, and may we all wonder why we can't proc. I'm still delaying the opener for a minute due to personal reasons, but it's time for another important public service announcement. Jobs have skills that deal more damage if you're fighting multiple enemies. For a red mage, your AoE becomes good at 3 or more enemies. In this AoE state, you have 3 buttons. They look pretty similar to your single target, but wait a minute. This spell is the long cast time, and these two are the short cast time ones. No, it can't be. Is that a lack of parallelism in game design? Beautiful. I honestly don't know what I expected. So you cast one of these based on what mana you're lacking, and then you dual cast the red magic. Do this until you have enough mana to use your melee AoE skill with Moulinet. At 4 targets or more, you should use Moulinet as soon as you have 20 of each mana. You can save some mana to burst a trash pack with Manafication and or Embolden. You want to hit 100 of each mana with Manafication, I'll elaborate on what this does later, to get 5 Moulinets in for AoE burst. Although you would also want to get 5 Moulinets under Embolden, that buff is usually something that you just press so that your party will deal more damage. You could also Swiftcast right after the last melee button to use Impact as a pseudo finisher, although that's if you're getting real fancy. For 3 and 2 target AoE specifically, that's when things can get a little bit confusing and way beyond the scope of what I want to cover for AoE rotations. Although you can always look those up if you're curious. Don't forget to slap down other AoE off GCDs for extra points. And that's everything you need to know about speeding through dungeons. Time to attempt another opener. As usual, this is just one of many openers that this job has at its disposal. Typically there is high variance with where you want to place Embolden depending on the party composition. However, this is the standard opener that works in most general cases. Pre-pull with acceleration sometime before combat starts to ensure procs for the opener, usually about 15 seconds before. Precast for Thunder about 5 seconds before combat. Ideally, you should land the spell right as battle begins. Now use verraise. This is when you can use a damage pot. As a note, it doesn't matter which skill you cast first or second for the opener, so long as your first 2 casts are verraise and verthunder. This will put you into a double proc state. In this case, I'm casting Verstone and then casting verraise to not overwrite the Verfire proc. Weave both Flesh and Embolden. Now cast Verfire and cast Verthunder to not overwrite the Verstone proc. Weave Core and Contra Sixt. Cast Verstone and then cast Verthunder. Weave Engagement and Manafication. Note, we use Engagement here to not leave melee range. Use your melee 1-2-3 combo, weaving Core sometime during the melee combo since it was reset when you used Manafication. After the 3rd button of the 1-2-3 combo, we use Displacement, so try not to die, and use Verholy. Then finish with Scorch. Keep in mind that both Verholy and Scorch are instant cast spells that will not give you a dual cast. Now cast Verfire and cast Verthunder, weaving a final Flesh as it is back up. We are now done with the opener, and I can explain some other various details. As I briefly mentioned, the opener puts you into a double proc situation, something that you might not be familiar with if you haven't been using a proper opener. In this scenario, you will use verraise and verthunder not based on which one has less mana, but based on which skill you currently don't have a proc for, since we don't want a chance to waste any procs as they can be rare enough as is. For example, in the opener, if you cast Verstone and you already have a Verfire proc, you want to dual cast verraise to not waste that Verfire proc and vice versa. This is fine with the exception that you never want one mana to be more than 30 than the other. This is a strictly greater than 30. You can have exactly 30 as the difference in mana without issue. If you are approaching that edge case, you will cast based on which one you have less mana of, although that situation is pretty rare. So for the general rules for the rotation, if you have 2 procs, dual cast Ver Arrow or Ver Thunder based on which ones you don't have a proc for. If you have only 1 proc, use it, and then dual cast Ver Arrow or Ver Thunder based on the color of mana that you need. If you have no procs, use Jolt 2, and then dual cast Ver Arrow or Ver Thunder based on the color of mana that you need. That is the real red mage rotation. As far as actual burst goes, Manafication both doubles your current black and white mana, while also giving you a 5% magic damage increase for 10 seconds. You want to have at least 40 of each mana before pressing this button to be able to instantly use your melee combo and finishers for the duration of the damage buff. It should fall off right after you cast Scorch with proper play and internet connection. The reason why this is annoying is because it's on a casual 110 second recast time, making it not naturally line up with anything else buff-wise. You should try to use it on cooldown anyways, but actually optimizing this might be a lot harder than you think at first, as it requires knowing how a specific encounter will work. Sometimes using this at different intervals is better, although for learning the job, just use Manafication on cooldown as best you can. It is fine if you overcap your mana, even if you have something like 60 mana before pressing Manafication. The only time it will get weird is if you have more than 70 of each mana type, in which case, you have to wonder why you're in that situation. Was that something you could have avoided in that encounter with better play, or is that something that you have to actually work on? Or maybe you just have too much spell speed. But you know what? To get you off the ground in this class, don't worry about any of that. Just use Manafication on cooldown with a minimum of 40 mana each. Manafication also resets the cooldowns of Core and Displacement/Engagement, so make sure that those are on cooldown before you Manaficate. Embolden is a buff that you don't like. It buffs your magic damage while buffing your party's physical damage. Meaning if you have a party composition that has more than just yourself as a caster, its value is instantly diminished. This doesn't matter outside of optimizing, but after the changes to Monk's Brotherhood, I wouldn't be surprised to see this just buff all damage in the next expansion, as it's currently the only job that's DPS buff doesn't affect all party members equally. Yeah, you could talk about inner-released and crit and direct hit buffs, but I digress. What this means for you, Embolden and Manafication increase all of your GCD damage. Yes, your melee combo's damage is magic, so long as it's the enchanted version and not the normal. However, your off GCDs are all physical damage, and will not be buffed by your own buffs. Although they will benefit from another Red Mage's Embolden. This is cool until you're using Manafication on cooldown, and Embolden just kinda happens and doesn't actually line up with anything in your burst window. You will instead use this every 2 minutes to buff your party more than buffing yourself. Just to be a little bit more specific, lining these 2 cooldowns up is not something you will consistently do, but there are situations in which this is optimal that I'm not going to elaborate on. The final thing about this buff compared to everything else in the game, it starts at a 10% buff that reduces its effectiveness over time. The reason why you change the placement of this DPS buff in different openers is that some classes want the big part of the buff after your 3rd GCD, while others want the big part after your 5th GCD. Most classes prefer Embolden earlier, which is why it's placed where it is in the general opener. And that's everything you need to know about Embolden. Reprise is an off GCD that reduces the damage of all enemies around you by 10%. Oh, wait a minute. That's Reprisal. Enchanted Reprise is your on-demand movement tool. The enchanted version is ranged and instant cast, costing 5 of each black and white mana. Assuming you have full uptime, you will typically generate enough black and white mana to use 2 casts of this in between each cast of Manafication without messing up your mana totals. For some decent movement tech, you can use a dual casted spell, cast 2 reprises, and then use Swiftcast to get 4 GCDs in a row of movement. That's about as far as you can go on Red Mage outside of your melee combo. Beyond this though, you can still move every other spell cast thanks to dual cast. Depending on fights and mechanics, when you need that extra movement, that's when Reprise is your friend to not drop your GCD uptime. To conclude, here are the damage cooldowns and things that you want to keep track of. Make sure that you weave all of these after an instant cast spell, or single weave them in between parts of your melee combo. You have Embolden on a 2-minute cooldown. Use it when it's up for your party, even if you can't benefit from it as much yourself. Try to use Manafication on cooldown every 110 seconds, and don't worry too much about overfilling your mana more than actually using the skill on cooldown. Use Core on cooldown every 40 seconds, as well as either choice button every 35 seconds for maximum damage. Although I did mention not flinging yourself off the edge, it's also better to use engagement if you need to use your melee combo soon and still be in range. And don't try to double weave another off global cooldown with displacement, you will not have time for that. You also get Contra 6 every 35 seconds and Flesh every 25 seconds to manage as well. Finally, use Acceleration every time it's up to guarantee the next 3 procs. It will even work on Verflare and Verholy if your mana is dead even, or proc the one that you have more mana of. Just never make the difference in your mana greater than 30 or you will implode. Alright, now for the actual reasons you play this class. Verraise will revive a dead party member. Always use dual cast to instantly cast verraise. If you hardcast this spell when you need it, you're doing it wrong. You can literally combo Jolt into verraise because Red Mage can raise people consistently faster than anyone else. It's not the most mana efficient raiser, but it's beyond the fastest. VerCure is a heal that should be used for transitions in fights before the boss comes back to get a dual cast set up so you can instantly use Verarrow or Verthunder when the boss comes back. You can use it to save yourself if you're totally fucked and the healers are dead, but you should probably try to raise a healer over trying to heal the party with this. Unless you're below level 64, in which case, you can kinda replace a healer in dungeon content if they died. Addle will help mitigate magic damage boss attacks, and since you have many weaving opportunities, plan to use this on stuff like Burnished Glory. Remember to use Surecast to ignore knockback mechanics, and cast if you get a paralysis debuff. Finally, you will want to use Lucid Dreaming for actual mana if you fall below about 6,000 to ensure that you don't bottom out. At this point now, you can skip to the end of the video to avoid extra brain wrinkles, although if you want some tips to increase the sauce levels of your gameplay, here are some smaller optimizations and random things to think about with Red Mage. I'll first elaborate a little bit on Red Mage mobility. When talking about caster mobility and Red Mage, you will hear two very opposing arguments. One group of people say it's the most mobile mage, since every other cast is instant cast, giving you many movement opportunities. Others say it's actually the least mobile, because it can't string together multiple instant cast spells as easily as even Black Mage, making it actually the least mobile caster. I think this is the natural discourse, as both answers have their merits. I also think this discussion originally started with a group calling Red Mage the most mobile caster, and people countering with it being the least. In reality, it's actually a lot more complicated of a thought exercise, as it's hard to compare Red Mage to Black Mage and Summoner in this regard. Red Mage can move every other spell cast because they are instant, allowing it to consistently make adjustments. However, Black Mage and Summoner can plan their instant casts out to string multiple together during segments of fights where they need to move a bunch. Red Mage also has Reprise and its melee phase, which they can string together instant casts, but it's not as freeform for where they can place those instant casts for movement. Ultimately, all mages have their movement options, but Red Mage is much easier to pick up, and if you're new to harder content, you don't have to be as calculated with your movement tech as Black Mage and Summoner. In practice though, it's a bit hard to evaluate. In my opinion, I think Black Mage is the least mobile, followed by Red Mage, with Summoner being the most mobile. Yes, Red Mage has to go into melee range sometimes, but that's not a mobility issue, that's a melee uptime issue, which is its own separate problem unrelated to mobility. As for Red Mage itself, know what tools that you have at your disposal, but drop your GCD to avoid death if you have no movement tech available. Another interesting thing to talk about is Swiftcast Optimization. Outside of using this for movement, you can Swiftcast either Verarrow or Verthunder on cooldown, and it will be a damage increase. However, in most high-end fights, you will want to save Swiftcast for movement, as it's more important to keep your uptime rather than use this on cooldown for damage. If you are using it purely for damage, the only thing that kinda sucks about it is that it will misalign your dual cast, alternating them on different GCDs than normal. This is because a Swift-casted GCD will not give you dual cast. As a consequence of this, your off GCD damage skills might have to drift by a GCD when you change this alignment, which can be a bit annoying. Although if you do find yourself in a situation where you're wondering why Flesh and Contra 6 don't seem to be coming off cooldown at the right time, this could be the reason why. If you are swift casting purely for damage, the same rules that I described for mana management still applies to casting either Verarrow or Verthunder. Once you feel pretty good about your melee combo, here are some ways that you can make your mana more efficient. If you have no procs when you reach 80/80 mana, then you don't have to optimize anything. If you have a proc and it's the mana color that you have more of, then you also don't have to optimize anything. However, if you have a proc and it's the same mana type of the one that you have less of, it makes sense to use that proc and then cast the opposite mana type to still guarantee a proc from Verflare or Verholy. If you have both procs, this is when you can dump a proc by casting the one that you have less mana of and then the opposite one. This will waste a proc, but will allow you to get another one from your melee combo. If your mana is dead even and you have 0 procs, that's when it would make sense to use Jolt 2 and either Verarrow or Verthunder to uneven your mana before going into your melee phase. You can also use Acceleration if it's up, instead of casting extra GCDs to guarantee a proc from Verflare or Verholy. These are just some examples of how you can be more efficient with your mana and your melee combo. It does get more confusing if you're trying to fit a melee burst window in before a phase transition or the boss dies, but this is stuff that you can start thinking about if you want to be better with your procs. Want to make Acceleration a bit more useful? Just using it on cooldown works for being quick and dirty. As you move up the optimization tree, you want to ensure that you don't waste Acceleration while it's active. The rules for this are pretty simple though. If you have both procs and you're between 60 to 80 mana, you don't want to use Acceleration. This way you can avoid a guaranteed double proc situation going into your melee phase. The other thing is not to use Acceleration right before going into a melee combo. This is because it will fall off too early before you can utilize it fully. If you are using Acceleration around the time you are going into your melee combo, you should use it after Enchanted Zoro, or whatever it's called. This way you can actually use the stacks without it falling off too early. Acceleration is considered to be a gain as long as you get at least 2 procs out of it on cooldown. And that's everything I'm going to talk about with some small optimizations you can make. If you want to go even further beyond, you can look into double melee combos under damage pots later in fights for some real ghost pepper sauce. I am not even close to qualified to explain the situations in which that is optimal. To conclude, Ver. This job is one that is easy to pick up, but can actually be pretty hardcore to optimize. Similar to old monks, I always see red mages going absolutely nuts with damage numbers that make me feel inadequate, so I have no idea what they're doing, but it's something amazing. For me though, it's not really my thing, especially because you can waste dual cast on sprinting, eating food, and even using potions. Although if you're looking to get into a job, its skill floor is nice and low, making it easy to just be okay at. Even if you aren't going hard with it, it's still valuable to bring to a party. However, if you find yourself playing Red Mage a lot and starting to get kind of bored with it, looking into some of the advanced optimizations can bring that spice back into your life. Think of it like Viagra. Now let's get out there and verraise a healer.